And we're happy to introduce a topic, human trafficking and the role of the pharmacy technician.
Thanks, Judy. This is Laura Lederer. I have been working on human trafficking for many years, and I will be your presenter today. First, I wanted to just thank Judy Neville, because she has for many years been a leader, and she saw the need for specialized training on human trafficking and the pharmacy technician long before many did. And so I've been working with her for years, and we finally made this happen. I have an hour to go through with you a lot of information on human trafficking, but I wanted to first, before we even talk about the course objectives, discuss a little bit about why it's important for us to learn about human trafficking, particularly for pharmacy technicians and health providers. For a long time, we saw this as a law enforcement issue and a human rights issue. And no one realized that in actuality, this is really a health issue before either of those two, and that health providers, including pharmacy technicians, were seeing trafficking victims and not realizing this. How do we know this? Because we've done surveys. There have been a number of research projects which have shown that trafficking victims have serious health problems. They have mental health problems. They have physical health problems. They have violent injuries from violence in trafficking. They have substance use disorder issues. They have just a whole myriad of what I call the 3 I's: injuries, illnesses, and impairments. And pharmacy technicians are on the front lines. You will be encountering those potential victims and survivors in the work that you do. And so we want you to be trained. So our course objectives in this course are to be able to describe the types of human trafficking and potential risk factors, to identify individual and environmental indicators of trafficking, to identify individuals who may have experienced trafficking, to utilize a trauma-informed, person-centered, multidisciplinary approach, and to assess the unique needs of individuals who have experienced trafficking and deliver appropriate services to individuals who have experienced trafficking. And finally, to share the importance of trafficking awareness and responsiveness with others in your work environment. So those are the 7 course objectives, and we're going to go through them in this next hour. We're going to do this with the SOAR framework, which is a framework that allows us to keep in mind the best ways to help individuals who may have been trafficked. It's a trauma-informed approach that encourages professionals to be mindful of the experiences that human trafficking victims might have. So what is the SOAR approach? SOAR stands for Stop, Observe, Ask, and Respond. These 4 this 4-tiered framework is what we're going to go through. So first, stop, to be able to describe trafficking and the common risk factors, and then observe, to identify individuals and environmental indicators of trafficking, to address individual need, and then ask, to screen and identify individuals who may have experienced trafficking. Now, there's a specialized approach to this with pharmacy technicians, and we can talk about this a little bit, and to respond, to coordinate across multidisciplinary stakeholders to make sure that trafficking victims and survivors get the appropriate services that they need. So this SOAR framework is what we'll be going through, and you'll see at the top either the S, the O, the A, or the R as we go through those 4 tiers. So what do we mean by human trafficking? Human trafficking is a crime involving exploitation of someone for the purpose of compelled labor or a commercial sex act. using force, fraud, or coercion. Now, this is the definition. It's an abbreviated definition from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. One note, it's really important to know that where a person is younger than 18 and they're found in commercial sex of any sort, that it's a crime, whether it's force, fraud, or coercion. You don't have to prove, in other words, you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion if a person under 18 is in commercial sex. And that's the US law. So a little bit more about terminology. We're going to be using the term patient or client for an individual that you encounter in your professional capacity as a pharmacy technician. A victim is a person who is currently experiencing trafficking. And it's usually used when we're referring to the laws and the statutes that provide protections or resources, like the Trafficking Victims Protection Act uses the word victim in the law. A survivor is an individual who is out of the trafficking and who's working toward healing in the aftermath of the trauma of trafficking. And moving from victimization to thriving and overcoming is a process, sometimes a cyclical process. And it's important to remember that individuals with lived experiences are multidimensional. They're much more than their victimization. Survivors often say to us, all we are asked for is our story. They just want to hear our terrible, sad story, and then they don't want anything else. Well, a survivor-informed process will encompass much more than just telling the story of somebody who's been victimized in human trafficking. It will consult survivors in all the parts of the work that we're doing to prevent trafficking, to prosecute traffickers, and to protect and assist trafficking victims. Now, how are we approaching this? We're approaching this from a public health approach. Remember, I said that we used to think of this as a law enforcement problem and a human rights problem. And then we realized that even before law enforcement uncovers a trafficking victim in the course of an investigation, a prosecution, a conviction, health providers are encountering trafficking victims because they're first responders. They're on the front lines, and particularly pharmacy technicians who are, at the counter every day, dealing with and working with all of your patients, all of the people who come to the counter. So the public health approach is the science of protecting and improving the health and safety and well-being of people and their communities. So there's private health and there's public health. And human trafficking is both a private health and a public health problem. And so we want to address it from a public health approach. And here is a slide that talks a little bit more about the difference between a criminal justice framework and a public health framework. So in a criminal justice framework, we uphold, the legal framework, and we're working with victims because that's the terminology in the law. There's a more defined time frame. The beginning is the investigation. The end is the hopefully conviction of the trafficker. There's a justice orientation in a criminal justice orientation often. It's government-based, whether it's city, state, or national or federal. There's a criminal justice system in place that is driving this, and the goal is to punish the traffickers and recover the victims, and that's where that ends. The public health framework advances individuals, so the private and the public health. You have patients and clients, not victims. You have that long-term process, not just that one clinical, or one moment. And it involves the entire the individual, his or her or their family, the community and it's community based, and it also is prevention centered and prevention driven. So that is the framework within which we're working, and pharmacy technicians are very much a part of that framework, and and understand that framework. So what are some of the guiding principles for working on this? The SOAR training has identified 6. First, inclusive of all types of human trafficking. Some people say that there's been an emphasis on sex trafficking, but that there's just as much, or that it's just as important to have an emphasis on labor trafficking. And the work that's been done in the US shows that we have both sex and labor trafficking in this country. And in fact, one of the big organizations that works on trafficking has identified 25 different types of human trafficking in the US, mostly breaking down the sex and labor trafficking into different types. For example, in labor trafficking, debt bondage, involuntary servitude, peonage, those kinds of things. It's culturally and linguistically appropriate, so that we're taking into account the differences and the different approaches that people have in their communities. It's trauma informed and person centered, and there's kind of a four square, which I will show you here in the notes. Approach to being trauma informed. Trauma informed means that you realize that there's a widespread impact of trauma, and that there are potential paths for recovery. It recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in individuals, families, in staff, and others involved in working with trafficking victims. It responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into their policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. This is an important part of the work that we're doing, because in trafficking, it's not just oftentimes one bad thing that's happened. It's what we call complex trauma, many rapes, a lot of violence. We'll talk about unpacking that a little bit, but when you have complex trauma, it's really important to have a trauma-informed approach. Multidisciplinary refers to the fact that we have to have a multidisciplinary approach. As pharmacy technicians, you have your mission and mandate. And we'll be talking a little bit about what that is. And when we first started talking with doctors and nurses, they said, well, we can't be identifying trafficking victims because then we'll have to report it. We're not law enforcement. Or they would say, we're not social workers. We can't help people like that. No, you're a doctor, you're a nurse, you're a pharmacy technician. But you have to be able to identify that community of people and organizations that can help you do what we call a warm handoff, so that when your work is done, if there are other needs, additional screenings or more specialized healthcare or housing or substance use disorder treatment, all of those are a part of the work that need to be done, and it's done in a multidisciplinary approach. And each organization has its mission and mandate. All have to know about each other and be able to work together. Then survivor informed. I've been working on this a long time. As one survivor says, nothing about us without us. We have to have survivors involved in this process. Why? Because they know about they know this issue from the inside out. The only reason I knew and was able to testify when we first started to draft and pass the Trafficking Victims Protection Act about the the transit of trafficking victims from a little town in Veracruz, Mexico, up across the border. They walked across the Rio Grande River. They walked 3 days and nights through the desert, and they were picked up in a van in Texas and driven to Florida to a series of trailer brothels. How do I know all that? I know it because I talked to the survivors, and the survivors told me because they had been through it. They also have told us, as we've done surveys, about their health issues. I've spoken to more than 300 survivors about their health issues. And so we know about them because of survivors. And we also know what survivors need because survivors are telling us. We need short-term emergency care, and we need long-term, employment and opportunities and education and technical training and help with our families and counseling and so on and so forth. So everything we do must be survivor informed, and we're working every day to perfect that approach. And then finally, data driven. For a long time, we had a story here and a story there. And then a senator said to me, give me one dry study and I can move my legislative, counterparts along to draft and pass a law. And so we began to do research, and we began to gather evidence that could convince people that this was a problem globally, but also in the United States, and that we needed to work on it. And that is what these 6 things mean. And that framework is a very important one for the work that we're doing. I have worked also a long time on implicit bias. For many years, implicit bias was dealing with race and ethnicity and nationality and some of the explicit, conscious things that we think, but also some of the subconscious thoughts, feelings, and biases that and perceptions and attitudes that we have. We took those and we've begun to work on those with trafficking victims, because people make assumptions about trafficking victims that oftentimes are just not true. And these conscious and unconscious judgments can, interfere. They can interfere with our ability to effectively and ethically serve trafficking victims and survivors. So, if you have a bias about an immigrant and what that immigrant has been involved in, or for instance, one survivor said to me, I came in and I was pregnant and everyone just assumed I couldn't have the baby because of what I had been, because of what I had been involved in. They assumed prostitution, but she was actually a sex trafficking victim. And so they were urging her to get an abortion. That is an unconscious or an implicit bias. So those kinds of things we want to try to overcome. And here are, only recently, several groups of doctors and nurses have begun to work on what they call the core competencies for a human trafficking response. In other words, these are the 6 things that we want everyone to know in order to effectively work on preventing trafficking, identifying trafficking victims and getting the right services to them, responding appropriately, prosecuting traffickers, and protecting and assisting the victims. And these are competency 1, nature and epidemiology, so understanding the nature and epidemiology of trafficking. 2, evaluating and identifying the risk of trafficking. 3, doing a needs evaluation and understanding the needs of those who've experienced trafficking and what they're at risk for, what their both short-term and long-term needs are, how to provide patient-centered care, the legal and ethical standards that are necessary. And we won't be able to get into all of these, but this at least shows you what these competencies are. And then finally, more and more, we're looking to prevention, because once a person has been trafficked, they are physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually devastated. And it is so important that we begin to work upstream to try to identify some of the risk factors and prevent the trafficking from ever happening. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about those things in just a minute. So here we're now starting on the stop, describing the types of trafficking and common risk factors. And we went over the fact that there are two kinds of trafficking: labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And I want to say here that in these notes, there are, there's the actual legal definitions of labor trafficking and of sex trafficking. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but I am going to say that it's important to know the types of these, how these usually occur and where these occur. We have over a long period of time, we've realized that labor trafficking often occurs in the kinds of industries that are labor intensive, whether they're janitorial services or hotel, restaurant services, construction, mining, all of those that take a lot of human labor. You will oftentimes find labor trafficking, and included in that also is domestic servitude, which happens in private homes behind closed doors. And then sex trafficking can happen in, out on the street, in brothels, in bars, a lot of different places these days where commercial sex can be sold. And it's important to know the whole pipeline of activity that is included in human trafficking. So there are the actions or the suspect activities: recruiting, transporting, harboring, obtaining. And then in sex trafficking, there's also advertising and soliciting and patronizing. And then by force, fraud, or coercion, unless in sex trafficking it's a minor, and for the purpose of the forced labor or commercial sex. So what is the role of the pharmacy technician as a part of the larger healthcare provider field? You play a very important role. We want you to be able to identify trafficking victims and respond appropriately. And this includes, a whole range of responses that are appropriate for your role. It might be treating, it might be referring, it might be reporting if there are federal mandates, but there's a whole range of responses that are appropriate. And second, we want you to be working in your community with your, with your colleagues, and then in the larger community to help develop protocols for those who've been trafficked, and then also to link up with those who can help trafficking victims. So why is it important for pharmacy technicians to know about trafficking? Well, when we first started this work, it was Judy who pointed out that pharmacy technicians are providing healthcare, and pharmacy technicians are working the counters and may encounter trafficking victims and survivors. And so the new research that we have shows that victims of trafficking do go to drugstores. They go other places too, with and without their traffickers. They fill prescriptions, they purchase items, and pharmacy technicians work hand in hand with pharmacists. And pharmacy technicians are the ones who handle most of the prescriptions, and pharmacy technicians are the first responders at the counter. They receive and confirm prescription orders. You prepare and fill prescriptions. You interact with customers. You answer questions, and you have the ability from the counter to see and hear things that may be of help. I've just listed a few here of the examples of pharmacies providing healthcare. Most pharmacists can administer vaccines, and some states permit pharmacy technicians to vaccinate. And there are all kinds of vaccinations that can be given in pharmacies, from COVID and hepatitis. I'm not going to read them all. Measles and mumps. You know what they are. But people are coming in to get these vaccinations to prevent serious communicable diseases, and pharmacy technicians may encounter victims in this process. In addition, you can watch for prescription filling patterns. New research is showing that trafficking victims and survivors may have distinctive prescription filling patterns that could indicate that they are experiencing or they did experience human trafficking. What do I mean by that? Well, frequent purchases of pregnancy tests or emergency contraception, regularly filling medications to treat STIs and sexually transmitted diseases, frequent requests for early refills, claims that medications are lost or stolen, using a variety of acute care services, urgent care, emergency rooms, resulting in prescriptions from different clinics for several conditions. And there may be other indicators that are particular to pharmacy technicians that we should begin to gather and list. And I'm hoping that this will be a partnership that we can work on building and filling in what these indicators look like from the perspective of the pharmacy technician behind the counter when you're helping someone in front of the counter. So here is one example of that. When I was doing focus groups on health and human trafficking, one of the Florida survivors said, "I grew up in a small town in Mexico. When I was 16, I was sold to my dad to pay off a gambling debt. He sold me to a trafficker who trafficked me from Mexico to Florida. I was held against my will in a trailer brothel with 10 other girls. We were sold for sex 7 days a week and also forced to do janitorial work on the weekdays. So it was both sex and labor trafficking. Every week, the trafficker took us to the drugstore to buy personal items. When he was there, he went to the pharmacy counter where he purchased condoms by the boxes of 1,000. So he was purchasing wholesale boxes of condoms. And she looked at me and said, "Why did no one ask the question, who needs 1,000 condoms a week?" And so we realized that we needed to include pharmacies in our training, and that pharmacy would need particularized kind of training so that they could spot indicators and recognize potential trafficking victims and then know what to do and how to respond. Here's another example. Again, from a survivor. When I was 16, I was trafficked in Minneapolis, Minnesota. My trafficker took us to high-end hotels in downtown Minneapolis, where he approached men in the hotel and sold us there. Most of the men didn't want to wear a condom, so my trafficker had one of his girls purchase Plan B, the morning after pill, for us and gave it to us after we came home at night. I took a lot of it, not knowing what it was, and my body is still recovering 5 years later. So again, being able to recognize if someone is coming in and purchasing over the counter or from behind the counter, some kind of medication or birth control or contraception or other item that might indicate that they're a trafficking victim. I have a slide for health providers that says, multiple pregnancies, multiple abortions, multiple STDs, multiple, kinds of morning after pill. All of these kinds of things are indicators of human trafficking that we can use, and they can be indicators of labor trafficking or sex trafficking. So here's a little bit more. Oh, here, I'm sorry. So the trafficking, a little bit more about the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. This is that action, means, and purposes. It's called the AMP model, and it was developed by the Department of Justice. The actions are in the law. These recruiting, harboring, transporting, providing, obtaining, patronizing, soliciting, and advertising is for sex trafficking only. Here's the means: force, fraud, and coercion, and the purpose. Then we want to unpack a little bit, what does it mean, force, fraud, or coercion? What is, when we say force, fraud, or coercion, what do we mean? Well, when we say fraud, it involves promises. So that young girl that was picked up by that trafficker in Minneapolis, he had told her that he was working in a hotel, and he promised her a job in a high-end hotel. And he said she, would be greeting customers. Then when he got her in his clutches, it changed. So that's fraud. That's a classic case of fraud. A promise of one thing, and then, it's a kind of a bait and switch. And then, being trafficked into labor or commercial sex. Coercion involves the threat of serious harm or physical restraint. We had one young woman who said, when my doctor asked me, was I safe? When he saw the bruises all over my body, I said, I lied. And I said, yes. And why? Because I wanted to live another day. So there's physical coercion where where somebody is physically coercing you to do something. And there's also psychological coercion. One trafficking victim said, no, he never touched me, but he took me downstairs to the basement, and there was a cement slab, and there was a dead young girl laying there. And he said, that's you if you don't do what I tell you to do. So physical coercion, psychological coercion, and then of course force. And when we did our survey on health issues, we unpacked this for trafficking survivors, because if you ask them, was there force, fraud, or coercion, they tend to say no. Or if you say, were you trafficked, they're not quite sure. But if you say, were you kicked, were you hit, were you beaten, were you burned with a cigarette, were you stabbed, were you shot with a gun, then they say, oh yeah, that happened to me. So those kind of physical harm, physical violence, meant to control victims, and it happens a lot in trafficking. Here is an example. An employer promised Mariella $1,800 per month, paid holidays, housing, and other benefits, but then he didn't pay her or give her time off. What means was the trafficker using to exploit her? Well, obviously, he was using fraud, because he promised her all of these, a good job. That sounds like a really good job. And then he didn't give her any of those things. And so he was compelling her to work without pay and time off and all the things he had promised her. Now, we're often asking in the first S, stop, who's at risk? And I first want to preface this list that comes from the Department of Health and Human Services. by saying victims can be any age, any race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, and so on. However, some populations, such as women and girls, may be disproportionately at risk. And here there is a list. Individuals with substance use or substance abuse disorders, individuals experiencing homelessness, people of color, disconnected youth, immigrants, migrant and seasonal workers, indigenous communities, LGBTQ2IA plus individuals, individuals with disabilities, survivors of other violence, boys and men, and older adults and in-home workers. We've seen all of these kinds of trafficking, kinds of individuals in trafficking. And so these are at-risk populations that we want to be aware of. Remember when I said that we need to get upstream and prevent trafficking? One of the things we're working on is ACEs, which are adverse childhood events and the risk of trafficking, because new research is showing that when there's childhood abuse or neglect or household dysfunction of any kind, and there's a whole wheel here, I'm not going to read it all, but any and all of these combined, ACEs, adverse child events, can increase the risk of trafficking. And so as we move upstream, we're going to be wanting to look at these ACEs and see if we can prevent those, and then hopefully that will help decrease trafficking. This is a slide that just emphasizes what I had said before. We know that human trafficking victims and survivors go to seek health care. They seek care from the system. This is one study. There are other studies, and I will have some of that information available for you. But we know that healthcare providers, and that is a very large, there are lots and lots of people who are included in that umbrella term, need to know about trafficking because they are first responders, and victims and survivors are seeking healthcare from them, including pharmacy technicians. Now we're on O, observe. Once you know all the basics, you want to be able to identify the individual and environmental indicators of trafficking, and the red flags that can indicate human trafficking. And there are a lot of them, and they need to be tailored, in my opinion, to the particular professional sector, because a healthcare provider who is going to be doing a physical exam and, will be able to see bruises, that are covered by clothing, has a different set of physical indicators than a pharmacy technician who is going to be encountering someone across the counter. So we need to build these red flags in a particularized way that can help pharmacy technicians identify possible human trafficking. But here are some of the indicators. Physical, I'm sorry. Let me just go back. Untreated or undertreated workplace injuries, bruising, burns, exposure to toxic chemicals, that's for labor trafficking, respiratory issues, high number of sexual partners, and I went over some of these others, multiple pregnancies, multiple terminations, multiple rapes, all those kinds of things. Behavioral includes confusing or contradicting stories, reserved or avoiding interaction, acting out by children. One survivor said to me, I was known as the bad boy in school. No one knew that my stepfather was, physically abusing me and selling me to friends of his. But everybody just thought, boy, he's a really terrible kid. He does nothing but, bad stuff. He's always acting out. So those kind of behavioral problems. And then environmental, which are mostly for labor trafficking. And you'll be able to look at these notes also. Barriers that prevent identification. There are individual related barriers, meaning the victim, and provider related, meaning the person who is the healthcare provider. Some of the individual related indicators are that they don't even know sometimes that they're being trafficked. They don't understand until sometimes many years later that that's what happened to them. They don't know their legal rights. They don't have identification. I can't tell you how many times victims told me that their identification was taken from them, or that they didn't have an address because they were going around in a circuit. There could be a language barrier so they can't express themselves very well. They could fear deportation or law enforcement. They could fear being returned to an abusive home, jail, or foster care placement. There are all kinds of things that could prevent somebody from telling what's actually happening to them. There are also provider-related barriers. Sometimes providers lack knowledge about human trafficking, and we now are in the process. Some states have laws that require those who have direct contact with patients to have a yearly training in trafficking. They may have preconceived notions about what a trafficking victim is like. They may just want to check off the box. Are you safe? Yes. Click, check. I ask, check. Or they might not understand the laws, or they might lack trauma-informed care, or they don't think it's their role to get involved. I can't tell you how many doctors told me, oh my gosh, if I do uncover a trafficking victim, the paperwork, all the terrible things that, I'll have to deal with law enforcement. I'll have to find a place for them. Yes, all of that comes with this. And that's why we're training you on how to identify and then to respond appropriately. Here is something that will be of interest to pharmacy technicians: common relationships between victims and traffickers. So oftentimes the victims say, I told my boyfriend, it's okay, okay, go ahead. I gave him permission to sell me for sex. Well, if you're under 18 and you give your boyfriend permission to sell you for sex, you're a trafficking victim. And so it doesn't matter whether you consented or not. Boyfriends are often traffickers and pimps. Employers in labor trafficking can be traffickers. I don't have enough time to tell some of the stories, but working with Department of Defense, we were hiring contractors who were hiring subcontractors who were hiring subcontractors, and those subcontractors were hiring workers and they weren't paying them. They were taking all of the money for themselves. So employers can be traffickers too. Friends of the family, immediate family. We have stories of grandfathers, of stepfathers, of one story not included in this, but a young girl was being examined. There were signs of trafficking. The doctor took her to a private room, and the person who had brought her in, she said, was her grandfather, and he was passing her around at his Friday night poker parties, and to kind of bring the poker players in for these poker parties that he was making money at, and strangers. And I have had survivors tell me, I was, getting gas at the gas station, and somebody pulled up and threw me in their trunk. So it's a gamut of kinds of things that can happen. Now on ask. Um, and again, here we need to have particularized protocols for pharmacy technicians, and hopefully AAPT can be involved in developing those, because you will not be screening individuals. You will not be examining them in a private room, most likely. And so the ask may look different for pharmacy technicians, and we need to develop that fully so that you will be able to, um, you know, identify victims and then know how to respond appropriately. So if you do suspect, if there's a way to, um, to ask a few questions, to gain trust, to find out some information that might reveal what is going on, depending upon, what what your situation is like in your pharmacy. Um, you want to be able to do that. Now, disclosure is not the goal, but if somebody did disclose to you that something bad was happening, like sometimes somebody has passed a note saying, "Help, I'm being held prisoner," and the only way that person was rescued was because someone acted on that note. Disclosure is not the goal, but if someone discloses, you need to be able to act on that. You know what to do. And this is not necessarily as relevant here, but these are person-centered interviewing techniques, creating that atmosphere of trust, making sure that that the person talking with you understands that anything they say is confidential, making sure they understand mandatory reporting, you know, um, using an interpreter who knows what they're doing if somebody can't speak English, and engaging the client or the patient so that you can help them. That's the goal. In ask, we want you to just remember the effects of trauma and violence. We want you to have some knowledge of what you would do if you do identify a victim. And we want you to minimize the possibility of re-traumatizing. And there's some very good trainings that can help with issues of mandatory reporting, how to involve the person who you need to report, if it's for instance, if you uncover a minor who's being trafficked, to involve her in helping her to fulfill those mandatory reporting requirements. And finally, responding. We want you to be able to promote resiliency, to respond appropriately, so that you will be able to promote resiliency, healing, and catalyze, an exit strategy or a rescue. And we want you to have survivor-informed responses. There's a lot more on many of the websites about that, and I can provide that at the end of this. And most importantly of all, for pharmacy technicians, we want you to be aware of what other services are available in your community, so that you could refer, or you could make a call, or you could do a warm handoff if that was required of you, or if that was asked of you by the victim. And all of these are some of the disciplines that are involved in treating trafficking, in helping them to escape trafficking, or in helping them to heal from trafficking. Again, this is the SOAR framework. We've gone over it. And in this training, you learned how to describe the types of human trafficking and potential risk factors. You learned how to identify individuals and environmental indicators. We talked about the specialized role that pharmacy technicians play in screening and identifying those who've experienced trafficking, and we gave a couple of examples of that happening, and utilizing a trauma-informed person-centered approach, and assessing the unique needs of an individual who's experienced trafficking and helping to do. You won't be delivering those appropriate services besides just your pharmacy technician services, but you can do warm handoffs, or you can find ways to get them to appropriate services. And finally, and most important, sharing the work, the information you've just learned about trafficking, and how important it is for those who have direct contact with patients and clients to be able to identify the signs and indicators of trafficking and to be able to respond appropriately, that whole, um, uh, spectrum of responses. This is a training that was developed by the National Human Trafficking Training and Technical Assistance Center. And we tailored it for pharmacy technicians, and we have some additional materials that are available on the NITAC Training and Technical Assistance Center, which is here on the screen and available to you, and also the human trafficking hotline, where you can report either confirmed or suspected cases of human trafficking, and then let others, do the investigating. I am so happy to be a part of this training. I know that there's much more work to be done, but having pharmacy technicians who are on the front lines, trained and ready to identify victims of trafficking, to know how to respond appropriately, and maybe even to help us develop protocols and guidelines for pharmacy technicians, maybe for the pharmacy technician, the American Association of Pharmacy Technicians, and others. All this is work that still needs to be done, and I'm looking forward to this partnership that we have with the AAPT, and I know it will be a good one over the years. Thank you.